Picture this. You're an American ace. Your P51 Mustang just got ripped apart by flak, and you're stranded deep in enemy territory. Most pilots are looking for a place to hide. But Bruce Carr? He was looking for a ride. 5 days later, he didn't just make it back, he landed a stolen Nazi fighter right on his own runway. No radio, no German lessons, just pure, unadulterated guts. This isn't a Hollywood script. This is the story of how Bruce Carr stole a war. Part 1. The Mustang Down. Survival behind enemy lines. November 2nd, 1944. The sky over Czechoslovakia was a freezing, slate-gray hellscape. Bruce Carr was 20 years old, but in the cockpit of his P51 Mustang christened Angel's Playmate, he felt like an immortal. He was part of the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Pioneers, and they were deep in the lion's den, hunting for anything that moved on the ground. The mission was simple: strafe a German-held airfield. But at 400 miles per hour, just a few feet above the treetops, simple is a death wish. As Carr lined up his sights on a row of parked junkers, the world exploded. A streak of light, a deafening clank of metal on metal, and suddenly, the cockpit was filled with the acrid, choking smell of burning glycol and oil. Anti-aircraft fire, the dreaded flak, had found its mark. The Angel's Playmate wasn't playing anymore. Her engine sputtered, coughed a final cloud of black smoke, and died. Imagine that silence. 1 second, you have 1,500 horses roaring in your ears. The next, you're just a heavy glider made of aluminum, falling toward a forest filled with people who want you dead. Carr didn't have time to bail. He was too low. He gripped the stick, his knuckles white, and guided the Mustang into a brutal belly landing. The sound was like a freight train crashing into a scrapyard. Dirt, rocks, and branches tore at the fuselage until the plane finally skidded to a halt in a muddy field, shrouded in steam and silence. He scrambled out of the wreckage, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was alive, but the clock was ticking. In enemy territory, a downed pilot is a trophy. For the next 5 days, Bruce Carr became a ghost. The American ace was now a scavenger. The cold was a physical weight, soaking into his flight suit and chilling his bones. He had no food, no map that could help him walk hundreds of miles back to Allied lines, and only a Colt .45 that felt useless against a whole Wehrmacht division. Every snap of a twig was a heartbeat skipped. Every distant bark of a dog was a German patrol getting closer. He spent nights shivering in the undergrowth, watching the headlights of German trucks pass just yards away. He ate whatever he could find: handfuls of frozen berries, scraps of turnip from local fields, anything to keep the stomach cramps at bay. By day 5, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a cold, hard desperation. His boots were soaked, his spirit was fraying, and his mind started playing tricks. But as he crawled to the edge of a clearing, looking out over a small, busy airfield, Bruce Carr didn't see a prison. He saw an opportunity. He was done walking. He was done hiding. If he was going to die, he decided he'd do it at 30,000 feet. He looked at a German Focke-Wulf 190 sitting on the tarmac, guarded by soldiers who had no idea that the man they were looking for was already planning his flight home. Part 2. The Audacious Plan, Infiltrating the Luftwaffe. The airfield was a hornet's nest of activity. From his hiding spot in the tree line, Bruce Carr watched the German mechanics' men in greasy overalls scurrying around the Focke-Wulf 190s like ants on a carcass. This was the Luftwaffe's pride, the butcher bird. It was faster, meaner, and more heavily armed than almost anything in the sky. And Carr was about to try and steal one. Most people would call this a suicide mission, honestly. It was. But after 5 days of eating frozen turnips and sleeping in the mud, Carr's survival instinct had mutated into something else, a cold, calculated fury. He wasn't just hungry for food anymore. He was hungry for the sky. He spent hours studying the rhythm of the base. He watched the guard rotations, the way the flashlights swept across the tarmac, and the specific planes that were being fueled up. He didn't just need a plane. He needed a plane that was ready to fight. Finally, he saw it. An FW-190 parked near the edge of the runway, separate from the main hangars. The ground crew had just finished topping off its tanks and walked away for a smoke break. This was his window. It was now or never. As night fell, Carr became a shadow. He began the slow, agonizing crawl across the open field. Every inch felt like a mile. The grass rustled too loud. His heart beat too fast. He could hear the muffled laughter of German soldiers in the distance, and the clinking of beer bottles. They were celebrating another day of war, completely unaware that an American pilot was inches away from their prize. He reached the tarmac. The cold concrete felt unforgiving under his torn boots. He moved from shadow to shadow, ducking behind fuel drums and crates of ammunition. His eyes were locked on that butcher bird. Up close, the Focke-Wulf was a monster. The black swastika on the tail seemed to stare back at him, a silent warning of what would happen if he got caught. Carr reached the landing gear. He pressed his back against the cold metal, gasping for air. He was so close he could smell the stale aviation fuel and the hot engine oil. He looked up at the cockpit. It was too high to jump. He had to find a way in without making a sound. Slowly, painfully, he found the footholds. He hauled his exhausted body up the side of the fuselage. His muscles screamed in protest, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. He reached the canopy and slid it back. Click. The sound felt like a gunshot in the quiet night. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, waiting for the shout of a sentry or the beam of a searchlight. Nothing, just the wind whistling through the hangars. Carr tumbled into the seat. It felt wrong. Everything was different. The smell was different, a mix of German tobacco and heavy grease. The labels on the gauges were in a language he didn't speak. Benzin. Joule. Luft. He was sitting in the belly of the beast, and he didn't even know how to start the engine. Think, Carr, think. He ran his hands over the controls in the dark, feeling for the familiar shapes. A throttle is a throttle, a stick is a stick. But German engineering had its own logic. He found the fuel valves. He found the battery switch. He found the heavy inertia starter. But there was a problem, a big one. The sun was starting to peek over the horizon. The airfield was waking up. He couldn't hide in the cockpit anymore. If he didn't start this engine in the 60 seconds, he wouldn't be flying home. He'd be standing in front of a firing squad. He gripped the starter handle. His palms were sweating. He took one last look at the woods where he had hidden for 5 days. This was the moment of truth. He was about to wake up the whole Luftwaffe, and he only had one shot to get it right. Part 3. The German cockpit. Flying the enemy steel. The sun was a sliver of gold on the horizon, and for Bruce Carr, it was a countdown to a firing squad. The airfield was humming now. He could hear the distant shout of a sergeant, the clatter of breakfast tins, and the rhythmic thump-thump of boots on the tarmac. He was sitting in the belly of a Focke-Wulf 190, a plane he'd spent his entire career trying to blow out of the sky. Now it was his only ticket home. But there was a problem. A massive mechanical problem. German cockpits weren't built for comfort. They were built like industrial furnaces. Everything was backward. The throttle moved the wrong way. The gauges were in metric, and every switch was labeled in a language that might as well have been from Mars. Zündung, Anlasser, Fahrwerk. Carr's heart was drumming against his ribs. He closed his eyes for a split second, trying to recall every scrap of intelligence he'd ever heard about the butcher bird. He found the battery switch. Flip. The cockpit lights flickered to life, a ghostly red glow. He found the fuel levers. He pumped them, smelling the sharp, sweet sting of high-octane German gas filling the lines. Now came the part that would either save him or kill him, the starter. In a FW-190, you don't just turn a key. You have to engage an inertia starter, a heavy flywheel that needs to spin up to thousands of RPMs before it can kickstart that massive BMW 801 radial engine. Carr found the toggle. He pulled it. Wahashi! The sound was a high-pitched metallic scream that sliced through the morning air. To Carr, it sounded like 1,000 sirens. A German mechanic, walking past with a toolbox, stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the plane. He saw a man in an American flight suit sitting in the cockpit of a Luftwaffe fighter. Their eyes met for one eternal second. The German dropped his tools. Alarm, Amerikaner! Carr didn't wait. He jammed the starter engagement. Cough, sputter, boom. The 1,700 horsepower engine roared to life with a violence that shook Carr's teeth. A massive cloud of oily blue smoke erupted from the cowlings, momentarily blinding the soldiers rushing toward the plane. The vibration was incredible. It felt like sitting on top of a volcano. He didn't have time for a warm-up. He didn't have time for a taxi. He slammed the throttle forward. The FW190 didn't just move. It leaped. But because Carr was used to the counterclockwise rotation of his Mustang's propeller, the massive torque of the German engine caught him off guard. The plane swerved violently to the left, nearly clipping a parked Ru-88. Carr fought the stick, his muscles straining as he kicked the rudder pedals, forcing the tail straight. Bullets started whizzing past the canopy. The ground crew was firing their Mausers, and a nearby flak crew was desperately trying to crank their 20mm gun toward the runway. Carr ignored it all. He kept his eyes glued to the grass ahead. 40 knots. 60 knots. 80 knots. The tail lifted. The world became a blur of green and gray. He felt the wings bite into the air, and with one final desperate tug on the stick, the butcher bird broke gravity's grip. He was airborne. But as he tucked the landing gear and banked away from the airfield, a new chilling realization hit him. He had escaped the Germans, yes, but he was now flying a plane with giant black swastikas on the wings, heading straight toward the most heavily defended Allied airspace in the world. He had survived the ground. Now he had to survive his own friends. Part 4. The Deadliest Mile. Flying a swastika into Allied airspace. Bruce Carr was finally back in the sky, but he wasn't celebrating. At 10,000 feet, the cockpit of the Focke-Wulf 190 was a freezing, high-speed iron coffin. He looked out at those wings, those beautiful deadly wings, and all he saw were giant black swastikas staring back at him. To every Allied gunner between Germany and France, Bruce Carr wasn't a hero. He was a target. He was flying a flying bullseye. He had no radio that could talk to his base. He had no IFF transponder to tell Allied radar that he was a friendly. He was a ghost in the machine, heading straight into the teeth of the most trigger-happy airspace on the planet. As he crossed the front lines, the world below lit up. Pop, pop, thud. Allied anti-aircraft crews, his own guys, saw a lone German fighter streaking toward them and didn't hesitate. Black puffs of flak began to blossom all around him. Carr gripped the stick, dancing the butcher bird through the clouds, sweating bullets in the freezing air. He knew the drill. He'd seen it from the other side 1,000 times. But being the one in the crosshairs? That was a special kind of hell. "Come on, guys," he muttered to himself, his voice raspy from 5 days of silence. "It's me. Don't blow me out of the sky today." But the ground fire was the least of his problems. Suddenly, a flash of silver caught his eye in the rearview mirror. 2 P51 Mustangs, his own plane, his own group, were diving out of the sun. They'd spotted the FW190, and they were hungry for a kill. Carr watched them line up on his 6. He knew exactly what they were thinking. Easy meat. A lone German, probably lost, definitely dead. He saw the tracers start to zip past his canopy, bright, deadly streaks of light. His own friends were trying to kill him. Carr had a choice. He could fight back, he had the guns, he had the engine. But if he shot down an American, he'd never be able to live with himself. He did the only thing he could. He didn't fire. Instead, he pulled every crazy maneuver he knew. He rolled, he dived, he skidded through the air. trying to show them he wasn't acting like a combat pilot. He was trying to surrender at 300 miles per hour. The Mustangs stayed on him, relentless. They were confused. Why wasn't this crowd firing back? Why was he flying like a maniac? Carr spotted the airfield at St. Dizierholm. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't circle for a pattern. He jammed the landing gear lever down and dropped his flaps early, a universal signal of, "I'm done fighting." It was a massive gamble. Lowering your gear makes you a sitting duck. He lined up with the runway, the Mustangs still hovering over him like vultures. Below, he could see the ground crew scattering, sirens wailing, and Bofors guns swiveling toward him. He was coming in hot, a German predator landing in the middle of an American nest. He cut the throttle. The BMW engine roared one last time before settling into a low growl. The tires screamed as they hit the tarmac, and Carr slammed on the brakes, praying the landing gear wouldn't collapse. The plane skidded to a halt right in front of the hangar. Before the propeller even stopped spinning, Carr saw the jeeps racing toward him, filled with MPs, military police, screaming and pointing .50 caliber machine guns at his head. He sat there for a second, his hands shaking on the stick. He'd survived the crash, the woods, the Germans, and his own Air Force. Now he just had to survive the next 30 seconds without getting a dozen American bullets in his chest. Slowly, very slowly, Bruce Carr raised his hands and slid back the canopy. Part 5. Don't shoot. The return of the ghost pilot. The BMW engine finally coughed its last breath of oily smoke and went silent. For a few seconds, the only sound at the St. Dizier airfield was the ticking of hot metal cooling in the breeze. Bruce Carr sat in that German cockpit, staring down the barrels of a dozen M1 Garands and a pair of .50 caliber machine guns mounted on jeeps. The MPs were screaming, "Get out with your hands up." "Hands where we can see 'em, Kraut." Carr didn't move fast. He couldn't. He was exhausted, starving, and his nerves were fried. He slowly raised his hands above the cockpit rail, squinting against the bright French sun. He must have looked like a nightmare. His flight suit was shredded, covered in 5 days of Czech mud and engine grease. He looked more like a swamp monster than an American ace. He stood up in the seat, took a deep breath of the air that didn't smell like burning glycol for once, and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Don't shoot, you idiots! It's Carr, Bruce Carr." The silence that followed was deafening. The MPs looked at each other. They looked at the plane, a Focke-Wulf 190 with the black cross and swastika. Then they looked back at the filthy, bedraggled man standing in the cockpit. "Carr? Carr is dead," one of the sergeants shouted back, though his grip on his rifle loosened just a fraction. "He went down 5 days ago." "Well, I'm the ghost of Bruce Carr then, and I'm starving to death. Now get me some real food before I steal another one of these things." The tension snapped like a dry twig. His commanding officer, who had already written the letter home to Carr's family, came sprinting onto the tarmac. When he saw Carr climbing down the side of that Nazi fighter, his jaw hit the floor. He didn't know whether to court-martial him for stealing enemy property or give him a medal for being the most audacious pilot in the European theater. They didn't just give him a meal. They gave him a hero's welcome that nearly leveled the base. But the story didn't end with a hot plate of rations. The intelligence officers were all over that Focke-Wulf. Getting a fully fueled, perfectly functional FW-190, the legendary Butcher Bird, was a gold mine. They poked, prodded, and flew that plane until they knew every nut and bolt of German engineering. Bruce Carr hadn't just saved his own skin. He delivered one of the Luftwaffe's greatest secrets right to the front door of the 354th Fighter Group. But what about Carr? Did he take a desk job? Did he go home? Not a chance. A few days later, he was back in the cockpit of a P51 Mustang. He went on to become a triple ace, credited with 15 aerial victories. He flew in Korea, he flew in Vietnam, and he eventually retired as a colonel. But no matter how many jets he flew or how many medals they pinned on his chest, Nothing ever topped those 5 days in the mud and those 30 minutes in a stolen cockpit. Bruce Carr passed away in 1998, but his story remains the ultimate middle finger to the odds. It's a reminder that in war, your equipment is just metal and glass. What matters is the person in the seat. It's about that American spirit, the kind that says if you take my wings, I'll just go out and steal yours. So the next time you think you're having a bad day, just remember Bruce Carr. Stranded, starving, and surrounded. He didn't just survive. He flew home in the enemy's best seat. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you finish a fight.